Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's Roads to Research with Chris Ling. We are fortunate to be on the traditional lands of the Kusapsum and Lekwungen people here today, and I just want to take a moment for us all to acknowledge how lucky we are to learn and work on these traditional lands. The Roads to Research is a series that is funded by the Research Support Fund from the Tri-Agencies of Canada, and we are grateful to them for the cookies and coffee out there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk to us about Greenspace.
A small but select gathering. Oh, better turn this on. How's that? There we go. So yeah, small but select gathering, and I realize I'm competing against many people who are on holiday or have the flu. And I know which one I'd rather have, but I have neither, so it's all good. So I can come here. So this is a presentation based on work I did while I was on my research leave last year, and I had a great opportunity to take that time off and go and visit places which normally would not necessarily have the time or space to do so. So what I'm presenting right now is really based on two case studies that I did whilst I was away. One in Christchurch in New Zealand and one in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. But I'm going to cover a little bit of general stuff around why I'm interested in urban green space, particularly, and how that fits in with some of the sort of the big global issues that many of us have interested in tackling. So my focus really is on what role urban green spaces can serve in addressing some of the big resiliency crises that the planet is facing right now. So I'm going to think, and that's really comes in specifically to the planetary boundaries idea, and I'm going to, for those that aren't familiar with what planetary boundaries are, I'm going to cover that in a second. And also what those green spaces can provide in the urban environment in terms of the ecosystem services and the multiple functions that those landscapes can serve within the urban landscape. But first, just to sort of get you up to speed with planetary boundaries. So the Stockholm Resilience Institute has done a whole lot of research looking at what are the natural systems that our activity on the globe is threatening and putting out of balance. And those are four things that they have, through their research, suggested that we are over a point at which the globe can function sustainably in perpetuity, and that is with climate change, biogeochemical flows, land use system changes, and biodiversity. And this is a rather busy slide, but I'm just going to sort of highlight a few things, because these are the sort of this is the data that they're using to make that case. So with climate change specifically, they're looking at carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere, as well as the energy imbalance. So that's the amount of energy that's sort of coming into the Earth and the amount that we're releasing. And so we're keeping more of that energy from the sun than we ideally would do if we want to have a stable environment. And this is obviously a few years out of date. We're now, I don't know if any of you listen to the CBC in the morning, where they give the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're now well up into the 420s and whatever, and it's going up every single year. So this is getting worse. Biogeochemical flows are things like the flows of minerals and nutrients in the natural cycle. So obviously these things always flow through erosion, through water action, through all those sort of processes that move things around the globe. But we're changing that because we are artificially adding materials into the environment, and that's creating imbalances, most significantly possibly of phosphorus and nitrogen, which obviously we're using as fertilizers, but are causing terrible, terrible problems, particularly in the water systems, where this stuff is creating huge amounts of increases in nutrients in both fresh and salt water. Land use system change, the metric that the Stockholm Resilience Institute uses is fairly straightforward. 1% of original cover of forest, so how much forest would we have if we did nothing to the landscape, and how much do we actually have? And they reckon that we can probably afford to be at about 75% of the what should be the global cover of forest. In 2015 we were at 62, and again that's also declining. And then biosphere integrity as indicated by biodiversity. So they have two figures that they've used that we are transgressing. One is extinctions per million species years, which is a slightly complicated metric, but basically there's always a background of extinction in the system. You know, species over geological time horizons, they come and they go. And that should be a background roughly around 10 extinctions per million species years. So a million species years is a bit like a person hour if you're figuring out how much it's going to cost you to renovate your basement, right? It's how many species exist and how long have they been around. And we're at least 10, if not 100 times over that background limit, and due to the activity of humans on the planet. And functional diversity, which is surprisingly little understood, but that's basically the amount of species you need within a system for that system to work properly. And you know, again, natural systems have a degree of resilience and a degree of wiggle room, but we're for those systems that are being measured, we're probably beyond that as well. But it's very difficult to really say for sure how many species you need in a system, because all systems are different, all species operate different niches, and some are probably more significant in a system than another. So that's the extent of the problem. It's an economic problem. I just put this in here just to show that, you know, there are real, you know, people say, oh, it's too expensive to do all these solutions. Well, this is what it's, you know, it's very difficult to estimate, but this is some of the sort of figures that have been thrown out there as the cost. So estimate global cost of climate change in 2030, possibly going to be around $2.4 trillion a year in the loss to the economy from what's going to happen as a result of climate change. Potential global cost of biodiversity, even more, like 14 trillion per year, estimated by the European Commission. So these are big, significant impacts on the global economy. By contrast, how much are we spending on this stuff? Well, here's some figures. We're actually spending a fair bit on climate change related spending, and this includes all sorts of different initiatives. So, you know, investments in clean technology, investments in tree planting, investments in trying to do better in certain processes whereby you can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted, and, you know, incentives for green energy solutions for homes. All those kind of things would factor into this. Global biodiversity spending, we're basically really, by comparison, doing very little, 7 to 10 billion. When you compare that to the cost, it's trivial. It's a sort of rounding error. And where are we putting most of that in? Actually, this is a bit out of place, this slide. But basically, most of the biodiversity actions that take place are buying land to protect it. We need to do that. That's great, but as I'm going to show in a bit, that's not sufficient, and it's not going to address the problem. And there's lots of reasons why that is the case. Another thing that we've been playing with, and I've actually been doing this with a colleague of mine, Leslie King, who I'm sure everyone knows, is that the idea we have is that if you do things for biodiversity, they're almost always going to have a positive impact on climate change as well. The converse isn't necessarily true. So things you can do to help climate change don't necessarily have, other than an indirect effect on biodiversity, whereby, you know, if we reduce the amount of climate change that's going to occur, it's better for biodiversity as well, but it's not quite such a direct link. So that's something else why I'm interested in urban green spaces as well, because I think a greater focus on those tidal landscapes is actually going to give us more co-benefits for both of these big crises. And of course, it's all about land use and land use system change, which again is another of those boundaries. So biodiversity policy focus currently is really based on more and bigger protected areas. And I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from thinking that putting stuff in a protected area is a bad idea, because I don't think that at all, and I think that's a very important part of the solution. But it's a bit like recycling as a problem for, you know, sustainability. It's not going to do it. It's an important thing to do, but it's actually not ever going to be sufficient for creating a solution for the whole waste system that we've generated. So it's a very similar kind of thing to that. It's important, but it's not sufficient. And it has all sorts of other problems associated with it. Protected areas often exclude people from biodiversity, and the best way to stop people caring about something is to exclude them from it. It also reinforces this notion that biodiversity is somewhere else. It's in those wildlands, it's in the protected areas, it's in the parks, as opposed to absolutely everywhere. And so again, you're creating a change in mindset that's net probably having a negative impact on what we try and do for biodiversity than it is a positive impact. It also limits the opportunities for biodiversity enhancement. If all your money is going into buying areas which are already good places for biodiversity, then you're reducing the amount of money available to actually improving biodiversity in things that we're currently managing very, very badly, and actually creating better natural systems within places like urban areas. And I've already sort of really touched on this, and it can create negative feelings towards biodiversity protection. If people feel that they're being prevented from accessing somewhere for this species they have no interest in or know nothing about. And there's been some research that sort of looked into how protected areas aren't actually that effective. So here's 3 quotes from 3 pieces of work looking at the biodiversity in protected areas versus biodiversity in non-protected areas. So here was one looking at forests in Africa, actually, and they found that there was no statistically significant differences in forest conditions between legally protected forests and forests governed by users who established and recognized forest rules. So this isn't comparing one forest that's protected with one that's clear-cut, but it's comparing a forest that's protected where no form of human activity is permitted, other than possibly some sort of very traditional sort of subsistence kind of activity, compared with forests that are managed in ecologically viable and sustainable forestry processes. So you're still extracting timber, you're still extracting resources, you're still extracting non-timber forest products, you're creating a community around them, you're creating economic well-being, but you're doing it in a way that's not sacrificing the ecological integrity of that forest. And in these 2 examples, there was no statistical difference in the ecology of the forests in these 2 different environments. Despite local successes of protected areas proving effective, so locally, in particular situations, protected areas can serve an enormous benefit. The processes of implementing them are hugely complex and hugely expensive, and so it's not going to be enough for us to protect. I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head the figure, but there's a figure that's been bandied around. So how much of the planet we would need to protect in order to ensure that we didn't lose ecological functionality, and it's an enormous amount more than we already have. And with our current sort of economic systems, we simply cannot afford to do that. And I'm not convinced that would be the right strategy anyway, when you have other sort of information which tells you that there are other ways of operating. And also, protection doesn't always consistently benefit species with small ranges. And that's particularly true when you think about what are the kind of landscapes that people protect. They're a very specific type of landscapes. They are usually aesthetically dramatic, or they are otherwise difficult to develop in a significant way. So there aren't very many sort of scrappy lowland, sort of indistinct, uninteresting, boring landscapes that are protected, whereas there's lots and lots of huge mountain ranges and fantastic coastal rainforests and things like that, which do get protected. Well, okay, that's fine, but don't kid ourselves that means we're protecting all the ecosystems on the Earth, because we're not. There's lots which are underappreciated, and so they don't get the same attention. So here's an example of one of the places I went to on my research leave. It's along a place called the Kinabanatang River on Borneo, which I probably pronounced wrong. Jeff probably knows how to pronounce that correctly. But and there's an orangutan up in a tree. And this is a wonderful, wonderful experience, right? Going down this river in a sort of small boat, seeing this amazing richness of wildlife on either side, phenomenal. Protected area. That is also a really good example of why protected areas are neither sufficient nor tackling the question. Just another picture along the river, a different type of landscape. But the vast majority around this area looks like this. Oil palm plantations, like as far as the eye can see. And these are all encroaching on that protected area, not legally, of course. It's illegal to cut down in the protected area and plant oil palm, but there's not sufficient enforcement. And anyway, once it's gone, it's gone. And people are just as excluded from this kind of landscape because it's all owned by huge sort of agro-business corporations. I mean, people work on it, but it's not. There's no sort of vibrancy of culture there. The reason there's so much wildlife in those protected areas is because they're running away from this, and so they've got nowhere else to go, and they're squeezed into these last little pockets of rainforest. And they're slowly getting eaten away as well. So it's absolutely necessary that these patches are protected, but it's not nearly sufficient for dealing with any kind of biodiversity crisis. By contrast, you go to some places around here which are managed by more local communities and farmers, and although you don't have quite the same richness, you don't have quite the same biodiversity, it's much a more vibrant landscape than this is a farm we're looking at here, this picture. And there's lots of biodiversity, and it's providing an income, and it's providing a community focus for the people that live there. We had the great privilege to be there at the right time to catch a Rafflesia flower in bloom. The biggest flower blooms on the planet, allegedly smell like rotten meat, although this was not very pungent when we were there, but hugely lucky to see it. But this is also biodiversity that's providing an income for the communities that live here, because sucker Westerners that happened to be in the area when this was were gouged an enormous amount of money to go and have the privilege of looking at this thing. So, but it's private land. It's owned by the families that farm there. And where is biodiversity getting lost? Well, it's most intense. Where the problem is the greatest is in and around our cities. And that's because our cities are expanding. That's because around those cities is where the most intensive agriculture takes place. And it's also because those cities generate a large amount of watercourse pollution. And so there is a real role for urban green space. In addition to some of these broader protected area focused ideas, to really have a direct policy of trying to increase the functionality in an ecological sense of urban areas by introducing green infrastructure through ecologically informed brownfield restoration, through changes to streams, bringing them back up to the surface if they've been buried, naturalizing channels, introducing green roofs and buildings, green roofs can be surprisingly biodiverse. Again, it's not replicating the more pristine, protected areas that may exist, but it's bringing biodiversity back into places which currently have almost nothing. And in addition to the benefits for biodiversity, you have benefits for other ecosystem services, for climate change, and also for the resilience of an urban area, particularly in dealing with adaptations to climate change, where a lot of solutions that can be used to deal with changes in climate often have a green space type of design about them. So urban shading to cool urban areas, management of water, because many places are going to be faced with more intense and more frequent storms, Provision of more local food, because why not grow things that can actually provide you with some sustenance in urban areas? And we're seeing lots of examples of these kinds of initiatives all over the world. So what I want to do is now look at two contrasting examples where green space planning is occurring in very different contexts and very different cities, and just to think about what might be the reasons why they turned out so differently. So my first example is Christchurch in New Zealand, and here are some new initiatives within the city to bring green spaces into a much more multifunctional existence. Some of these pictures here were places which were, all three of them were already green spaces. They're not new green spaces. I'll come on to the new green spaces in a sec. But they've all been sort of re-energized and redesigned to have a focus rather on sort of worrying about how much it's going to cost to maintain, which is what historically has been the deciding factor for what they look like, to what benefits can they bring the city. So all these areas, all these three pictures, they're all different places within Christchurch, were originally sort of mown grassy areas or rough grazing sort of in the sort of edge environments. All of them have now been redesigned for the purposes primarily of managing water. One of the big concerns they have in Christchurch right now with regarding to climate change is that they're going to be facing much more flooding from, it's a very, very low-lying, very, very flat environment. And they're very concerned about rising sea levels and the impact that's going to have on flooding in the city. Not so much from rainfall, but from just the water table gradually getting higher and higher. Not helped at all by the earthquake in 2011, which created an actual rise in the height of the water table as a result of the geological impacts of that. And we'll look at some of the other impacts of the earthquake as well. Also deliberately building in fun places for kids within these green spaces. They just literally just randomly left, deliberately to attract kids, randomly left straw bales lying around and sort of bits of vegetation. So the kids have just built forts and that kind of stuff. The particular area in the bottom right there is surrounded by houses. There's just a little track to get in. It used to be a very inhospitable kind of scrubby patch, which they've constructed wetlanding, constructed trails, and just made it a much nicer place, not to mention the increases in biodiversity and potential for controlling flooding as well. Let's go skip over that. So I need to reorganize these slides a bit. So I'm going to start with Kuala Lumpur, even though I started with Christchurch, but there you go. So this is a situation where you have a very rapidly growing city, and these couple of slides illustrate that rapid growth. So this is a Google Earth shot from 1984 of Kuala Lumpur, and here's at the same scale from the same point in 2019. So you can see how the city is expanding, filling in the gaps that were originally largely rainforest or agriculture, and significantly reducing the natural systems that are running through the city. Just to give a few bits and pieces of statistics, so it also illustrates the rapid growth of the urban area. So in 18 years, it's gone from 1.3 million to 7.5 million. The amount of green space per person over 4 years reduced from 13 meters squared to 8.6 meters squared. And just to give you a sense of what that means, the WHO recommends there's about 10 meters squared of green space per person for a healthy city. Although there is a certain amount of evidence from aerial photographs that currently actually the amount of green space, depending on how you define that, is relatively stable and has increased a fair bit between 2013 and 2016. But that doesn't really give a picture of what exactly is being put into the urban environment and what is being lost. So this is the sort of stuff that's at the probably the pinnacle of the green space within the city. This is a remnant piece of rainforest right in the heart of Kuala Lumpur, called Bukit Nanas, or the KL Eco Forest Park. It's sorry about that. It's about 9.37 hectares, but is slowly getting chipped away through development, and that's being lost to urban development. It's an amazing place. There's trails through it. There's a sort of canopy walkway. There's macaques running around in it. It's a fun place. And that sort of stuff, however, is what's being lost. This is quite well protected because it's a very well loved and known park, and it's right in the center of the city. There's also a lot of this kind of green space that exists, and unfortunately I did have better pictures of this, but a delightful guy on the metro in Rome stole my phone, and I lost a whole bunch of photos, but unfortunately there were more than one person taking photos, so I do have some. But there's these sort of little informal patches running through the city of Kuala Lumpur, along particularly sort of pedestrian links, round the sides and back of buildings. They're very poorly maintained. What I don't have, and is a photo that I did have, was actually an enormous pile of garbage that was over quite a large amount of this. But these are not formally designated as green spaces. And the way the planning operates in Kuala Lumpur is something is either gazetted as green space or it is not. And there's all sorts of sort of weird loopholes that the planning profession have, in the development community in Kuala Lumpur are exploiting, that mean that they can take out some of this quite interesting green space and replace it with either nothing or something that's basically just sort of mown bit of grass. There's rules which say that for in any development, 10% of it has to be set aside for green space. But one trick that folks at the City Hall told me about that they deal with quite often is that what a developer will buy a plot of land. They'll submit the design showing a nice 10% being set aside for green space, and then they will sell the half of the land that has that 10% on to another developer. So they've got permission to build on 100% of their lot, and then the other half is then sold to another developer who submits a new bit of design with 10% set aside for green space, but of course it doesn't take a mathematical genius to figure out what's happening there. There's also very much an idea of what green space is, and green space is not about ecology at all. Green space is purely for recreation. So that totally skews what people are looking to do with the green space that exists. And so, yes, new space is being, I've got out of sync again, sorry. Come back to that. So green space is being generated, but it's not the same kind of green space that's being lost. Certainly not in ecological terms. Climate change in Kuala Lumpur, the estimates are that there's going to be quite a significant increase in temperature, so obviously shading is going to become more and more important. Rainfall will become more variable, and so they're very concerned about the management of water through the watercourses, for extreme events. And the actual translation of Kuala Lumpur is that it is a muddy confluence, which gives you an indication of the kind of focus of the landscape there. Here is that muddy confluence, picture taken in about 1950. It was the earliest one I could find through my trawling. The two main rivers of the city, the Klang and the Gombak, which were the reason why Kuala Lumpur was set up in the first place as a sort of trading hub coming down the river. And the rivers meet, and this is why the city developed. So it's right at the heart and the core of the city. This is what that same muddy confluence looks now. Now, which profession has charge of the watercourses in Kuala Lumpur? Can anyone guess? The engineers. And the engineers have such a tight control over the water management that this has significant impacts for trying to build in green infrastructure into the city. There's a big program of beautification that is occurring in Kuala Lumpur at the moment. It's called the River of Life project. And the idea is to, throughout the length of the two rivers through the city, improving its aesthetic appearance, improving the water quality, creating parks, creating spaces that people will enjoy. Remember, as I said, it's all about recreation here, green spaces. So the idea of this being ecosystem functionality is not entering into the conversation. The folks on the ground, the actual sort of people working for the city on a day-to-day basis, they totally get the ecosystem functionality is part of this question, but they do not have the capability of actually getting that into the design, because the government basically just paid an enormous amount of money to a foreign contractor to come in and do all the design work for them. And also there is almost no, they were very open about it, the folks I talked to, there's no cross-departmental conversations going on. So the engineers do the river and the parks people do the bank, and they don't communicate in any way, shape or form on what that might look like in an integrated way. So what you get is this, for example. This is right by that previous photograph, that Modi confluence. You get a very formal, very managed, quite attractive recreational space. And I think the ultimate irony is represented in this picture, which again I had a better one of, but it got nicked, whereby we have an artificial water feature hanging over the river into which fish have been placed. I just leave that with you.
But they've got to monitor lizards, which would eat them.
Well, that's also a truth, yes. Words kind of fail me at this point. It's just crazy, and yet you can still see these wonderful concrete engineered river channels that exist behind it. The other kind of green space that's going in are these sort of private spaces. This is a park right at the foot of the Petronas Towers, where this is taken from the Petronas Towers, and it's a lovely park. But it's very, very formal. It's very focused on recreation. You can see a lovely mown grassy area with ornamental trees, artificial water with no kind of thought of sort of wetland communities or anything like that. And this is owned privately, although the deal is that the developers have to make it available for public use. And there's a lot of this kind of space cropping up in Kuala Lumpur, a lot of it actually on rooftops. So that 10% green space can in fact be on your rooftop, which doesn't necessarily have any public access, certainly doesn't have any real monitoring or enforcement as to what you're planting up there, and is often, from the few I saw, not, it's a few trees in pots kind of stuff rather than anything kind of trying to be designed for biodiversity. So let's move on to Christchurch. The big significant thing that's happened in Christchurch, of course, is the 2011 earthquake. And I'm just to give you an indication of the scale of the destruction that earthquake caused. Here's the sort of the boundary of the city pre-earthquake. And I'm going to zoom in. If you see the red square there, it's sort of the northeastern quarter of the city. You zoom in, you can see the River Avon there. You can see that there are some parks and green spaces. But then the earthquake happened, and you can see in the next slide how it's changed the fabric of the urban environment. So just focus on these areas I've ringed. And this is what it looks like now. All these were residential areas that liquefied in the earthquake, causing the most unimaginable destruction. And the extent of this is quite dramatic. So This is the lower reaches of the River Avon, one of the three rivers that runs through Christchurch. The most significant because it's the one that sort of connects the downtown with these eastern suburbs. It's sort of in the middle, where the other two are kind of on the northern and southern edges. And this is what, as I've alluded to, this is what they're really worried about in terms of climate change. Is the earthquake lowered the land and or rose the water table. Slightly difficult to really be sure which one is the truth, if not both. And liquefied the clay geology that was in these areas. And they're projected, of course, a rising sea level. And so they're very concerned about the amount of flooding that's going to occur along this river channel. So on one hand, devastation and real social upheaval, real economic upheaval. On another hand, a real opportunity to actually create some very interesting green spaces along these river channels where we suddenly have lots of space which nobody wants. This is what the so-called red zone looks like now. And you can see in these pictures some of the sort of the extent of the damage to the infrastructure very kind of visibly in that bridge. And then these weird environments of residential subdivisions with no buildings in, but still shrubs and lampposts and hydrants and standpipes and things like that. One of the bizarre decisions that was taken was that they actually demolished all the buildings and now manage it as basically they mow it. And they're trying to keep their options open. That's what they told me, because they don't want to close off any potential land use until they have carried out the full consultation and the full planning process, which they have literally just finished 8 years later. They released the draft to the federal government at the end of last year, just after I was there. But one of the criticisms that I heard when I was there was that, look, why didn't they just let it go, right? Like, why not keep some of the buildings there? Why not do some real interesting rewilding stuff? And they were worried about invasive species. You're probably very familiar. Big problems with invasive species in New Zealand, both animals and plants, thanks to the wonderfully insightful Europeans that thought a world would not exist successfully without willow trees and oak trees and things like that. So that's one consideration, which is fair enough. But it seems to be a very large maintenance budget for something that was completely unnecessary. But there you go. This is the planning document that's now been approved by the federal government, and this was a really quite good consultation process involving lots and lots of stakeholders. And they basically, partly because they didn't have much choice in it, but also partly because this was really what people were telling them, was to create this as a corridor for bringing in reintegrating native species into the landscape, respecting the traditional uses of the land, which was as a food gathering place. To me, it had certain echoes with the lagoon here, actually. So it was a place of meeting and gathering and food harvesting for the Maori people. But also keeping areas in that for other uses. Soft uses, because you can't really construct stuff in this landscape. I mean, you can, but it would cost you an awesome amount of money, and nobody's interested in that kind of development in Christchurch, which, with all due respect to Christchurch, is sort of at the arse end of the universe down there on the South Island of New Zealand. There's not a heck of a lot of interest in international investment in Christchurch. Although apparently a car company has actually used these streets to test out autonomous cars, because it's great. It's a real live residential street network without any of those inconvenient people living there, right? So perfect for that kind of thing. Not a long-term use though. And just to give you a little snap scale of the issue as well. This is a lot right in the heart of downtown Christchurch. It's a building that just collapsed, and it's still there. The struts and this sort of flooded basement that's just sort of sat there. And so they're really keen the real focus up to now has been on these downtown areas, which are psychologically quite significant. The other focus has been on. This is another sort of lot that was destroyed during in the downtown area that's just been left. And so this is one of the things they were worried about in that larger red zone area of all these invasive species coming in and preventing the natural regrowth of native vegetation. Another example of an empty lot in downtown. There's lots of these patches. So it's a city with lots and lots of green space. That's literally 5-minute walk from the center of the city, and you've got cows grazing on a site which used to be. I never quite got to the bottom of what it was. It was some sort of institutional building. Where did the people go? Well, a lot of people moved out of the area completely, but a lot of people moved into areas on the other side of the city that are being developed. And one of the rules that has been put in place for these new developments is they must incorporate green space. Now, the contrast between the kind of green space that we have here and the type of green space that was getting incorporated supposedly mandatorily in Kuala Lumpur is quite significant. This is almost all the new green space in these subdivisions has constructed wetlands and is designed both for recreation and also for biodiversity and also for flood management. I didn't show you the fact that quite a lot of these subdivisions are also rather distressingly single-story bungalow sprawly things, but nothing's perfect, right? But this is literally one that's just sort of opening up and is being developed right now. So, what are the differences? And this is my concluding slide between those two. Well, there's the obvious difference of one city where they're gradually losing or rapidly losing green space, and another where they've suddenly been, through rather unfortunate circumstances, find themselves with far more green space than they know what to do with. So that's obviously quite a significant difference. But I don't think that really explains it. I think what's key in Christchurch is that there has been a deliberate multifunctional approach to the green space that they're putting in. This is written right in all the planning documents and in the attitudes of the people that are making the decisions. There's some of these attitudes in the how to put it politely, the lower levels of the hierarchy in the Kuala Lumpur City Hall, that they get this stuff, but the decision is not being made by them. So on one hand, you have a focus on all of these things: biodiversity, recreation, community input, climate change. There's also economic development, but it's economic development that's focused on the local community and is generated by ideas from that local community rather than trying to attract international investment. In Kuala Lumpur, by contrast, it's only about recreation and economic development. It's about making things pretty so people want to come and invest there. Another very significant difference is that there is a separation of responsibility in Kuala Lumpur. It is possibly the most extreme example of siloization I think I've actually ever come across, where there is literally no potential whatsoever for working across those boundaries between the people who are interested in the green space, the people who are interested in the water courses, the people who are interested in the economic development. It's a complete disconnect. By contrast, I was actually given multiple tours of the red zone. Everyone was offering me tours, and I felt I couldn't say, well, I've already been around it. But yeah, come on then, you give me another one. One of them was a private consultant who had an office in City Hall and was directed by City Hall to carry out a lot of the design work that took place. Another was an ecologist that was working with the team that put together the big plan. He was a sort of quasi-academic. He'd fit in quite well at Royal Roads, I think. And work with local communities and that kind of stuff. And then all these people were basically given a vision that had come collectively from a lot of stakeholders, rather than something that was dictated from a sort of national government level. National government in New Zealand just said, go and sort it out, and we'll approve the plan once you've finished. Left it pretty much up to the local people to decide how to do that. It wasn't a perfect system, and there were some critics, but nevertheless, it involved lots and lots of people, as opposed to we have this vision of creating, we've seen what's happened in places like Singapore and Seoul and things like that, where they've really used their river to their advantage. We should do that, so this is what we're going to do. And all the design is taken place from international consultants that, for all the best will in the world, have no particular vested interest or understanding of the processes and systems that are taking place. So it's the separation there. In both cases, the private was involved, the public was involved, but only in one were the people involved. And in the case of Kuala Lumpur, although the private and the public were involved, it was very much a very rigid demarcation of responsibility. We give you the money, you come and tell us what we're doing. And so that degree of community involvement, I think, has made the real difference. And a recognition of the potential and multiple values that Greenspace can provide for the urban area, which can only come through a sort of transdisciplinary process, such as you can see in Christchurch. So I think I'll stop there.